This week, we are primarily studying the effect of economic development on democracy. But a country's overall level of wealth is not the only important economic influence on democracy and dictatorship. This video discusses the relationship between inequality and democracy. Income inequality varies substantially around the world. In this graph, lighter colors have higher levels of inequality. The reasons for this variation are unclear, however, as is the relationship between income inequality and regime type. Theories about how inequality affects the likelihood a country will become democratic tend to rest on one core assumption. This is the idea that under democracy, the lower and middle classes can influence tax policy, and they are going to have their elected leaders increase taxes on the rich to redistribute some wealth to social service programs that would actually benefit them. Redistribution in this sense is usually thought of as raising taxes on the rich, but it can also take the form of land redistribution. This is breaking up what were essentially once feudal estates owned by large landowners and giving smaller parcels of land to the people who actually farm it. Carlos Bosch, in Democracy and Redistribution, takes this idea and argues that democratization is only likely at low levels of income inequality. When there's a relatively low difference between the average income of the middle and upper classes, the rich are then less likely to oppose efforts to extend political rights to these classes. They just have less to lose from the likely tax increase that would follow. Our friends Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, the authors of Why Nations Fail, have an even more famous theory about inequality and democratization. In the book that made them famous, Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, they share Bosch's assumption about the motivations of the rich, but they also add in Robert Dahl's idea of regimes needing to balance the costs of repression and costs of toleration. They argue that the relationship between inequality and the likelihood of a transition to democracy is an inverse U-shape. At low levels of inequality, dictatorships are not likely to transition to democracy because there's just not much demand for it. The poor are pretty happy with what they have economically, so they don't demand more political rights. As inequality rises, however, dissatisfaction with the current regime also rises. Democratic transitions become more likely for two reasons. First, the poor have more to gain from a democratic transition, and second, the rich actually don't have that much to lose. At mid-levels of inequality, the cost of using force to repress protests is actually more than what they would lose from slightly higher tax rates. So rather than call out the military to shut down protests, they allow a democratic transition. At the highest levels of inequality, however, the rich have a lot to lose from democratization. Even though using force against protesters is costly, they would lose even more from redistribution, so they repress demonstrations and are able to avoid a democratic transition. These theories make logical sense, but they actually don't have a lot of support in actual data or experience. Bosch does provide evidence that there's a correlation between inequality and democratization historically. A regression of the Gini coefficient on democratic transitions between 1950 and 1990 does show a negative relationship. Acemoglu and Robinson, however, don't provide any evidence for their extremely influential theory at all. Other studies don't actually find a statistically significant relationship at all, and qualitative research demonstrates that democratic transitions in countries with high levels of income inequality are not actually driven by issues of class conflict. In addition, inequality often persists and sometimes expands under democracy. The poor actually don't usually end up successfully soaking the rich with new taxes after a democratic transition. In other words, the assumption behind these two theories is flawed. This doesn't mean that inequality and democracy aren't related or that inequality is okay in a democracy. There is in fact evidence that inequality can undermine democratic stability. It can make democratic backsliding into autocracy more likely. In addition, income inequality reduces the quality of democracy and encourages practices like vote buying and clientelism. But the full extent of these relationships is not yet clear. We need more research at both the cross-national and regional levels to better understand the problem. You might ask why I raise theories that don't have support, but it is for two reasons. First, the relationship between democracy and inequality is a fundamentally important issue. And second, Bosch, Acemoglu, and Robinson's theories have driven the majority of research in comparative politics over the past 15 years. Proposing ideas about how the world works, then testing them in a variety of ways, even when they're disproven, is just how the science of political science works, and it's one of the things that we're learning about this year.